New studies reveal the impact that both company and individual insolvencies have on the wider economy. With about 10,000 businesses entering administration each year, the number of job losses has reached more than 80,000. Well, to get some more on the findings of this report, we are joined now by Jones Partners Mangum Principal Michael Jones. Thank you so much for coming in to tell us more about this report. And this report is actually quite interesting. It's sort of the first of its kind as well.
Yes, it's a unique report, Bridie. We're trying to look at all of the broader macro and microeconomic factors that go into insolvency administrations, and also some of the specific industry changes that are taking place.
The trends. Just in terms of the levels, what have we seen over the past decade? I mean, what are we seeing in terms of the numbers of businesses and people going into bankruptcy?
There's been a steady rise in corporate insolvencies, and that seems to be rising, although very recently a slight trend downwards. In terms of personal insolvencies, quite fascinating. In the early 70s, credit cards were really introduced into Australia, and shortly after the credit cards were introduced, people may remember bank card, when it was introduced, bankruptcies and personal insolvencies shortly thereafter absolutely soared. Really, personal insolvencies are more of a reflection of what's happening in the consumer credit market. Now, very, very recent times, in the last quarter, we've started to see a slight decline in that. But there may be some other reasons for that maybe actually might look good on the surface, but may not actually be very good at all.
We'll delve into that in a moment. I just want to ask you more about corporate insolvencies, because it's obviously the SME sector that particularly gets affected here and has the most impact too, really, on the economy.
That's 100% right. The media often covers large corporate collapses with great interest, possibly because of a perception of lots of people being put out of work, possibly because of a perception of bad management or misconduct of management. But when we actually look at it, 82% of companies that fail, and this is good, solid statistics, are actually companies that employ less than 20 people. When you extrapolate that out, the research is actually showing that 82% of companies approximates to about 74,000 people per year. Now, compared to that, to the big corporate collapses of companies that employ over 200 people, it's only about 6,500. So really, it's the SME sector that's most affected by the insolvency rates in relation to the companies. And I think we need some perspective on that.
What can management do better to prevent insolvency?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned management. Research is showing, and it's very good data, that the top #1 reason for companies' failure is, in fact, management. Quite interestingly, the #2 and #3 reasons for failure, and I'll squeeze #4 in there. #2 and #3 sometimes swap around, being cash flow and profitability, and #4, and sometimes it jostles for #3 place, is actually failure to maintain books and records. But I'll simplify all of those. Failure to maintain books and records is a management issue. Profitability and cash flow is a management issue. So the top 4 reasons are really management, management, management and management. What can businesses do? It's very difficult because, particularly in the SME sector, you can't really separate the management from the ownership. And in the SME sector, it's often trade-based, family-based businesses that are affected in this area. I think, personally, that it comes down to the personality drivers of the individuals behind those businesses, and that's the critical thing behind success and failure.
I guess just on, the parts of the economy then that are most at risk, because this is interesting. We've sort of seen this change, given the moves in the economy as well, the balancing, the rebalancing of the mining sector away from the mining sector to, or perhaps non-mining sector. What's your view on what you're seeing here and how that's changing the outlook for industries most at risk?
The largest industries that are affected by insolvencies, and again it's the industries dominated by that SME space, is construction, retail and personal services. Interestingly, as the mining boom starts to soften off, we're moving from a different phase, from the investment cycle to the production sales cycle. There is a concern amongst the economists that are helping us write the report that the rest of the economy may not be able to pick up that space in the near future, and there may be some market gap in there. There are also some trends that we're watching very carefully in relation to the changing industry risks in Australia. We've seen the persistently high Australian dollar. This has come out report after report. It's not new, it's not particularly groundbreaking news. But it advantages some businesses areas, but of course it disadvantages other businesses areas, the main one obviously being manufacturing. But certainly tourism, there are aspects of tourism that are particularly disadvantaged by the high Aussie dollar, and there are aspects, bizarrely, of tourism that are actually advantaged by the Aussie dollar. So there are winners and there are losers in these dynamic changes that are taking place, and this is part of the reason for the research.
Just on the, I guess, the personal insolvency levels as well, what have you been seeing there?
Yes, a very interesting trend of very recent times. Personal insolvency levels for the first time for many, many years seem to be waning off just a little bit. Personal bankruptcies are actually dropping quite dramatically. Possibly that's masking the fact that those numbers are being swapped for sort of arrangements with creditors. But the reality is the numbers are still dropping off just a little bit. I suspect, we suspect, and the research is starting to demonstrate this, that that's more about a consumer conservatism. Consumers are putting the credit cards back in the pocket. They're not buying the boat and the car and the overseas trip. They're being cautious because, you know, the disasters overseas, the GFC, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, we better be very careful. And so I think that the decline in insolvency numbers on the personal level may be more a reflection of consumer conservatism and the statistical correlation between that and personal bankruptcies. Interestingly, that's also reflected in the investment part of the economy. You might have seen Glenn Stevens come out a few days ago suggesting that the investors are becoming altogether too conservative.
Well, the debate about, yeah, the risks with the low interest rate environment.
Yes. Now, we've got if we've got conservative consumers and if we've got conservative investors, we've got an economy that's starting to become extremely risk averse. And the concern that may be developing there is if we're becoming risk averse, are we becoming too risk averse? And what impact is this going to have on the general economic environment going forward into the short and potentially medium term?
That's interesting, because I was going to ask you about the risks from the low interest rate environment and, you know, what that does. Is that something to watch out for in the future, that people get caught, you know, taking on too much credit, perhaps in this environment where, you know, money is cheap, but that's actually not perhaps...
Well, it's not being evident, but there are some economists that are commentating on this, but particularly in the capital cities of Sydney and Melbourne, where real estate prices in particular have got very, very high. People are borrowing much larger amounts of money than they traditionally have. In an environment where interest rates are relatively low, you know, where they're absolutely sinfully record level lows. I can't recall in my whole history of living on the planet of interest rates for borrowers being so low, but I can recall interest rates being 19.5%. And I wonder how people will survive if their loan at 4.5% climbs to 19.5%, particularly with the large amounts of money that's borrowed. Now, there are economists on both sides of the argument here. Some say it's not a concern. Some say just do the mathematics. It potentially is a concern. It appears that, at least in the near and medium term, interest rates are quite safely low. So it's not an immediate concern, but potentially it could be a concern.
And just finally, I wanted to ask you too, because obviously structural issues are also going on here. It's something you mentioned in the report, you know, the digital disruption, ageing demographic, all of that, of course, as well plays into what we see.
Yes, ageing demographics is probably a more of a longer-term process. We're seeing some industries being advantaged, aged care, for example, and some industries, and within the real estate sector, some industries being changing altogether, a preference away from the sprawling acreage type block and 5-bedroom home to the more high-rise living. But in terms of the other structural things, the digital disruption is quite significant. We're seeing industries that are incredibly stressed because of a massive change in the digital age. Some SMEs just can't keep up with those changes and they're being disadvantaged. The other thing about the digital age is, of course, that your competitor is not the shop next door or the shop in the next suburb or in the next city. Your competitor could be anywhere in the world, including in Beijing.
Listen, we're going to have to leave it there. This is an annual report, isn't it? We're going to get another check from you. It'll be great to see how things have changed, panned out in a year's time. Really appreciate you coming in. Thank you so much for that.
It was a pleasure.
Michael Jones there, Jones Partners, and that on that first study, Insolvency Report 2014 from Jones Partners. We're going to take a very quick break here on First Business. Coming up, we'll have a look at what's making headlines in the papers today.